Portal is designed in a way that every chamber from start to finish is a tutorial. Each chamber is designed so that after you complete it, you have new information you need in order to complete the next one. Mind you, all of this is done without the player really knowing that they are playing a tutorial. And that's the beauty of it. I think most players will agree that tutorials aren't always fun, and being told you are playing a tutorial is a surefire way for players to immediately start having less fun. Valve are the masters of this, and in this video I am going to be breaking down the first 20 minutes of Portal and explaining how they did it. And I hope you enjoy. Now in the starting room you are actually introduced to some explicit tutorials. This is simply because the game is quite old nowadays, so standard stuff like explaining how to move with WASD and explaining how to interact with E and jump with space was more necessary back then. However, once a 60-second timer is up, the player is introduced to the mechanic which this game is all about. Portals. At this point the player isn't able to control where portals are or placed, that comes later. However, the game already teaches the player something incredibly important, which is the fact that if you go through one portal, you come out of the other one. Now this is taught in two ways. The player can walk through portals, of course, but the player can also see themselves through the portal. And this is done in a very purposeful and elegant way, in the way that the portals are placed on the walls. One is placed directly in front of the player, whilst the other one is to the side. The way that the portals are angled makes it so that the player is most likely to be able to see themselves going through the portal and coming out of the other side. Now as the player makes their way to the next room, they see a giant red button. This is purposely placed in the view of the player before entering the room, almost perfectly framed by the door. And this is all to make sure that the first thing the player does when they get to the room is stand on the button. But when the player does this, they learn two things. The fact that the button can open doors, as they can see that directly in front of them, but what they can also see is that there are dotted lines connecting buttons and doors. When the player steps off the button to go through the door closes before they can get there. This teaches the player that buttons need to be weighted down by something, and it cannot be themselves as they are the ones that need to get through the door. And then the next change to the room that is made is the introduction of the solution, which is the cube. Moving on to the next area, which requires the same solution, which is placing the cube on the button to open the door. The room introduces one new hurdle that's in the way of the player doing this. The player cannot simply walk to the cube or the button. Instead, the player needs to use what they have learned, which is the fact that they can move through portals. This will give them access to the cube. Then they need to learn that both them and the object can also move through portals. Now once they figure this out, they can then carry the cube to the button via the portal, and that cements this lesson, and the player can move on. The next room, the game slows down for some exposition whilst the player can see through a glass window that some sort of device is shooting portals. The door opens to the area at the perfect time, so that if the player immediately goes through the door, the device will shoot a portal which gives them access to a path towards the device. And once they have it, they are then allowed to shoot their own portal to open up a pathway back through the portal they just came through to get to the exit. The player by the end of it knows how to shoot a portal onto the surface, and they know that they can use that portal to come out of another portal on another surface. The next area is completely designed to reinforce the previous lesson. The player is presented with a gap that they need to get over, and the only way to do this is to shoot a portal on a wall to come out of the other portal the other side of the gap. After this is reinforced again, but this time by making the player shoot a portal which will act as the exit rather than the entrance. They go through the portal which was pre-established, and then they get to the exit. The next chamber brings it all the way back to the first area. The player enters the chamber and is immediately introduced to a button on the ground, with the exit in sight. Building on this, the chamber combines the lesson about buttons and doors and cubes with the lessons just learnt about shooting portals. The player shoots a portal to get the cube that is down the gap to the side of the room, places it on the button, and then they can progress. The next area doubles the amount of buttons and cubes, and reinforces the idea that sometimes you are shooting a portal that is an entry, and sometimes you are shooting a portal which is an exit. The player combines all these lessons which allow them to progress. So if you take a step back, that is now two areas back to back which reinforce the simple lessons learnt earlier in the game, whilst trickling in slightly more complex ideas to show the player how all these lessons work together. The next area is interesting. It's the first time since the cube and the button that the game introduces a completely completely new element, the energy orb. The player has to use the knowledge learnt and reinforce that objects can go through portals to make the connection that the orb needs to go through the orange portal and come out of the blue portal to reach the orb slot. So one aspect of this chamber which has not been taught before is that the orb slot exists, that it needs the orb to do something, and that what it does is that it lowers the platform to the far side of the level. Thankfully though, there are dotted lines connecting the lift to the orb, so the player only really needs to make the connection that the orb needs to go into the orb slot. To help with this, the only objects in this chamber are the orb and the orb slot, so much like the cube and the button at the start of the game, the environment is designed so that the player has all the tools necessary to reach the right conclusion without any distractions. The next chamber uses the exact same solution as the previous chamber, but with an extra twist which is important for the player to learn. Because the platform which is activated moves horizontally rather than vertically in this room, coupled with the fact that the only portable surface is to the left of the platform, the player needs to time moving through the portal so that they land on the platform and not on the ground. It is also important to note that this is done in a safe environment, where if the player misses the platform, they are not punished and they can simply try again. Now this won't be the case in the very next chamber. Now the next chamber throws a new twist to the energy orb puzzle. The first thing it does is it forces the player to understand that the player needs to change the initial trajectory of the orb, as the orb slot does not line up with the pre-established orange portal, which is the first time that this has happened. To do this, they need to place a blue portal where the orb is going naturally, allow it to come through the orange portal, and then replace the blue portal, aligning it with the orb slot so that when the orb bounces off of the wall and returns through the orange portal, it comes out of the blue portal and enters the slot. Finally, the player has to time the drop right onto the platform, but again, if they fail now, they die and have to restart the level. This chamber introduces an interesting new concept, something which requires careful design to not make it too much of a logical leap, as well as improve the player's skills of falling through portals. The next chamber goes back to being a little simpler, but it is very important. This chamber is set up, again, like all the other introductory button and cube puzzles, where the player is presented with a cube and a button, and they need to place the cube on the button to progress. However, this time there is an emancipation grid in the way. The player will soon realise that the emancipation grid dissolves any objects which pass through it. This could briefly stump the player, as surely this is the only way to solve the puzzle, because they've done it so much at this point, which is to simply take the cube and place it on the button. However, this chamber is again carefully designed in a way where through a bit of quick, logical-led exploration, the player will realise what to do. There is an orange portal to the top left of the room as the player enters. As you can't shoot portals through the emancipation grid, initially there is no use for this portal. But because it's the only other thing in this room, there's no more distractions, the player will most likely shoot a portal in the room and use the orange portal to see what's going on. Going through the orange portal will show the player that there is a gap in the wall that the player can shoot a portal through. Again, using their knowledge that they can take the cube through a portal, the player will realise that they can get to the button with the cube without going through the emancipation grid. This is very important, as avoiding emancipation grids is going to be a key part of late game puzzles. These next few areas are something which has been highlighted a lot by other YouTubers and game designers, as it introduces a really unique and interesting wrinkle into how portals work, and it's done incredibly well. This wrinkle is momentum. As the game says, speedy thing goes in, speedy thing goes out. Each area showcases in different ways how the player can use momentum to get to different places, by jumping from greater heights to generate more speed. So when you exit the portal, you get more distance. Now that momentum has been taught to the player, we get to the final chamber that we are going to cover in this video. Now that doesn't mean that the game is done teaching the player. In fact, I would say you could call this entire game one big puzzle. But this is where the player finally gets access to the portal device, which uses both portals, blue and orange. This is the culmination of everything we've learned so far. Again, like the first time the player sees the portal device, the game slows down whilst the player surveys the room through a glass window. The player shoots a portal which gives them access to a button, which on a timer opens up a door. This section introduces both a different type of button in terms of how it looks, meaning that you don't have to stand on it, you can just press it, but it also introduces timed door openings. Once the player makes their way through the portal into the room, they have to set up a portal so that the energy orb goes into the orb slot. This starts moving the platform. Then they have to time going through the portal so that they make it onto the platform. Finally, they retrieve the new portal device that uses both portals. They again have to use a button that opens a time door, and they must use both portals to get through it to the end of the chamber. Well, there we are. I would call what we just went through as the true tutorial section of Portal. Of course, like I said, the whole game could be called a tutorial. And this is what is so special about it. You never stop learning, you never stop getting new stuff thrown at you throughout the entire game. However, this section which we've covered, I believe, is the best section to look at when learning how to make tutorials for your own game. Hopefully these examples of what makes a good tutorial can really help you with your own games and projects. And again, like I said, play Portal if you haven't. Next week I will be going back to the regular sized videos, so don't get used to long ones. The aim of this channel is to provide bite-sized examples of good game design which don't waste your time, but sometimes you got to spend time on things which deserve it / need it. Thank you for watching. Tune in next week to another entry into the game design library, and keep on keeping on.